Fucking hell. This is where I lose it a bit. Way out of my knowledge base. It's way out of ones and zeros and programming and all that kind of thing. And we have to be careful, precise and accurate in the use of the words. This is where misunderstandings creep in, and I should probably stay out of this one. I'm less than a layman on linguistics, languages and philosophy. But fuck it, let's give it a shot. At least we might get to asking a few questions or expanding an awareness, even if that ends up in lazy application whereby you say, hang on John, that can't be right, let me look that up, and good for you. Ethics involves working out principles of behaviour that can be translated to life. That's pretty loose. The study of ethics is the study of moral values, which values are most important and which standards of morality we should require one another to adhere to, and which and what frameworks of ethics are available. Among the things that can be evaluated are actions, laws, policies, character traits, and in moral codes themselves. I was going to say, which ought we use? And therein lies the interesting question. To ask what we ought is, in of itself, a moral question. It's asking about shoulds and oughts, which are questions of a moralistic nature. And so this reduces to a similar question. Is it rational to ask rational questions? The answer has to be yes. If no, the very question itself can't be asked, at least not rationally. Same with why morals? Because. Yes. Okay, that's a bit of a linguistic masturbation. That's a bit slippery. So I think I should point out kind of like the meta. It's not what is to be judged as moral, but what standards of morality can we consider. So I think the question of ethics looks to frameworks rather than a prescription of specific values or specific decisions or actions. Yeah. These frameworks then the basis for developing morals and thereby making ethical decisions. Ethical principles are established rules for an action or conduct in relationship with others. The questioning and process of ethical decisions leads to a conclusion of what shall I do, but the what shall I do bit isn't the ethical bit, but it's the outcome of it. So ethical rules must be thoughtfully tempered by the wisdom of virtue. What does that mean? It's not an easy subject, and it occurred to me the woo peddler likes to use seemingly scientific word salad to sound impressive that you talk shit. You know, quantum incommensurate counter space of magnetic dipole inverse flux matrix fields. And if you know physics to a degree level, you know the last sentence was utter bollocks. It doesn't mean anything. But not many do. Likewise, I get the notion that philosophy is similar. It has names and conventions about things that do have very specific meanings and in their own way are technical. But to the uninitiated like me, a superficial reading kind of leads me to believe that there is huge potential for misunderstanding, so I should probably stay away. Not many, I don't think, are professional philosophers or logicians. To the layman, it sounds reasonable to ask a question such as, are morals subjective or objective? The devious questioner has set their trap. It's the question religious folk on the seminar circuit used to pull the wool over the eyes of the inquisitive mind. In doing so, it steers the audience to a conclusion from a false dichotomy. And reading around the subject a bit more, I've come to a little bit of peace with religion. But I do see a bit of a parlour trick with the grifters, though. Grifters, people who make money by proselytising the good book, for example, while either knowing it not to be true or not caring whether it's true. That is to say, they make money by saying things that they don't care if they're true or they know that are not true, but they know that they are popular to be heard and that people will pay money or advertisers will sponsor because it creates a large audience and the grifter may not in fact even believe what they're saying. Different from a true believer in that we might forgive them that at least they are with the pretense of being honest and proclaiming belief in what they are saying. So there are folk, I don't know what we would call them, professional debaters or professional defenders of a particular religion or doctrine. I'm not even sure that this small number of people that do this for a living are actually believers. They position themselves as so, but it's just so incoherent they can't possibly and be rational. I'm almost convinced that they enjoy the controversy and pain that they cause. To me anyway, religion certainly seems to have a sadomasochistic fetish about them. And I can't help but think that for those who have grown up out of it, and especially those who were once in ardent or devout religious families, have come to resent their indoctrination and wasted years. And it seems as though malice has started driving their behaviour, and they have a belligerent insistence on perpetuating the story. And in a kink twist, get paid quite well to do so. It's almost like kind of self-loathing or cutting the nose off to spite the face that, yes, I've wasted all these years believing all this crap. I'm going to take that crap. I'm going to spread it far and wide, but goddamn, I'm going to get paid to do it. In some respects, I can't blame them. Other people have spent 10 years, 3 years getting a degree, 7 years at vet school, and then spent 10 years getting a vocation that's useful. And similarly, you might imagine someone who spent 10 years learning the Bible and how to proselytize, and then realizing, actually, I've come to learn that this is no use to anyone. Now what? I spend another 10 years retraining on something else? So yeah, these professional debaters, I still don't have a name for them. They'll get into debates with the likes of the late Hitchens, and I suspect that they can't rationally believe half of what they say. But I think they use clever rhetoric and sophistry to con the audience by asking cute questions like, are morals objective or subjective? It sounds deep and profound, and it's a seemingly fair question. But then, so is, have you stopped beating your wife? The audience doesn't see it, and the performer can go on with the rest of the show and get paid for the performance. Then there's the likes of Jordan Peterson, who ramble off on metaphysical, substrate, postmodernist, cultural Marxist, Dostoevsky, blah, 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 bucko. Does anyone really know what he's on about? No one, I don't know. It seems that no one seems to know what he's on about. And no one knows what it means. And when they ask him to clarify, it seems to me that his style is to serve up some more word salad, and he'll gargle some more. And it's impossible to criticise because he can so easily claim that his words have been misconstrued. And yeah, it's because he's only just not quite speaking in tongues. Much in the same way of the meaningless phrase, quantum incommensurate counterspace of magnetic dipole inverse flux matrix fields is easily misconstrued to have any meaning at all. Still not clear? Let me explain. It's the temporal differential we call wakefulness in the cosmic interaction of subatomic particles operating in the quantum field, you see. I hope that's clear now, and if not, I can serve up as much word salad as you like, as long as you keep buying more books and attending my seminars. It's entertainment. In John Peterson's case, I think he even misconstrues his own words. He took a firm stance on the compelled speech thing, didn't he, with issue regarding Bill C-16. And the head of the Canadian Bar Association even said, nah, it's not that. So in matters of law, whose opinion should we take? Of course, millions of people believe Peterson, a psychiatrist, over a legal expert opinion in the relevant specialisation of law. Cult's a cult, what can I say? So I've noticed similar patterns with the online grift too. Much of it is performance art and not to be taken seriously. You and I, of course, are free to believe what we like, but as soon as someone gets on stage or interjects beliefs and claims into a public forum, it's open game as far as criticism goes. And I have less sympathy for those who are grifting, masquerading performance art as intellectual debate. It's a parlour trick, and it's telling, and it's icky. A comedian, for example, spends months, perhaps a year or two, developing material, goes on the road with a 90-minute set. It's tested, refined, perfected, altered, changed as per audience requirement. Some jokes won't land and are removed or changed, altered, it's improved upon. And so I wonder then, with the professional religious debater who has had the flaws in their arguments pointed out time and time and time again, why they come back year after year after year with the same rhetoric unchanged, even though what they claim has been demonstrably shown to be wrong time after time. There's no space for learning or updates. At first this just seemed infuriating and dishonest, and this is why such people, the grifters, don't like criticism. It reveals the con. It threatens their income. They'd much rather you paid money and attended their seminar or read their book, where it's all explained, of course. And their final twist of sickness is that they've deliberately misconstrued criticism. They twist it into an attack on free speech. So that alone should be enough of a red flag to warn people of the utter tripe they spew. If they can't tell the difference between criticism and threats to free speech, then we should also question their analytical skills and hold in doubt their reasoning capabilities. Is morality objective or subjective? If it's objective, they say, prove it. If it's subjective, they say, then anything goes. They will use this black and white thinking, this dichotomous model, to then leverage in the next question. Well then, where should I get morals from? Of course, they're so happy you asked, and I'm sure they will tell you exactly where. But those books are filled with immoral and ethically questionable philosophy and lots of contradictions. Like Jordan Peterson, it's the same grift. Write any rules, write all rules, rules for life, conflicting rules, and only highlight any particular rule one at a time relevant to the situation at hand, and hope, as you move from town to town, fleecing those who are honestly seeking answers, that no one remembers when you gave the opposite advice in the previous town. As a grifter, be sure to move on before they catch up, leaving a wake of awesomeness on your grand tour. Said Jordan Peterson of Frozen, the Disney film, the cartoon for children, that it demonstrates that a woman did not need a man to be successful. True! And as if there was something wrong with that, or as if that's the way it ought not shouldn't be. What's exactly he's saying here? I've not seen Frozen, but if you refer back to the series we did on Bob Iger's book, Ride of a Lifetime, we mentioned Disney's Hercules cartoon a little bit. I liked it. And we mentioned some of the tropes in those late 90s animated films from Disney's. Yeah, the hapless woman, the damsel in distress, the reluctant hero, a woman's place, and all that. Yeah, the underlying theme in the Disney cartoons of that era, the late 90s and noughties, is that a woman can find meaning, identity and purpose only through their attachment, commitment and marriage or support of the male character. Apparently, according to Jordan P. Peterson, Frozen was propaganda, not art. And grifters go on about the left being triggered. Cartoons, mate. Bloody cartoons. And I'll mention, Ben Shapiro and the WAP incident. But it's the same thing. People like Shapiro and Peterson have fixed ways of how the world ought to be and fixed ideals and how it can only work. And anything outside of this ideology gets them triggered. It's like they have very sensitive mental apparatus to detect the slightest change on their conservative outlook. I mean, conservative, perhaps not necessarily in a political way, but in a mindset that's fixed, ideological or traditional, preserving of an old status quo, reserved but tending towards the regressive. Christian ethics, so-called, based on the Bible, Christian tradition, or situational ethics, thus appeals to religious authority and does not really rely on reason. This is why the professional Christian debaters don't update their models. Year after year, spout out the same stuff, and they keep getting paid regardless. Good work if you can get it. Again, stuck in dogma and non-changing ideology, resistant to change. And in light of evidence to the contrary to their proclamations, they either have to not look at the evidence and remain willfully ignorant, or lie. And I have to ask, what useful function can any system serve that has to remain ignorant to survive, or lie to preserve itself? Even a comedian updates their jokes after a year tour, gets to the point that everyone's heard it before and demands something new. Christian ethics, like many other ethical frameworks, comes in flavours. Literalism, like Kent Hovind, believes the Bible, every word, and that it has to be accepted as is, literally, and is the word of God. Others take the position that meaning has been lost in the translation and that it requires proper interpretation, I presume by those so eminently qualified. Others see the Bible as a historical document of something, but now largely irrelevant, and others recognise it as a basic guide for life, but it requires work and application of reason to find meaning, find your own meaning. So a spectrum from the extreme to the more liberal. The Bible itself, I've never read it, a few lines here and there, sure, but it's filled with contradictions, and my concern would be then for the literalists. How do they know which to pick when there's a contradiction? Almost by definition, they cannot take it upon themselves to make their own judgment about which one to choose. For those who do subscribe to the idea that the Bible is the moral word, in this mental model then, no Bible, no morals. And as Dennis Prager recently blurted out over the internets, without the Bible, he would be a rapist. He did say that. He said it of all men, and since I assume he thinks himself as a man also, he's included in that set. And what really annoys me more, about Peterson and Prager and Shapiro and the likes is I don't think they really believe they crap they say. They're just grifting. And then there are the professional evangelicals. Due to the recent contagion and the social distancing requirements, in mid-2020, they've lost a lot of money. Churches have been closed and so on. Yet, conveniently, they'll claim that Jesus will protect you if you come to church and make tithing. But these people are killing people to keep the dollars coming in. And this is what I find reprehensible. They've cloaked their own shitbaggery and moral failings and sociopathic behaviour in stories of divine origin to assert authority. And in doing so are exploiting, let's say, honest, gullible or desperate people who want to belong to a community under the auspices of religious virtue or common interest or something. So not only financially exploiting them, but putting their lives in peril. Within these texts, and asserted with divine authority, are stories, narratives, injunctions, and conflicting commandments for every occasion. Kill, but don't kill. Seek knowledge, but knowledge is a sin. Embrace peace and love to all, but kill those dirty foreigners. Probably something in there about QA non as well. I don't know, fucking hell. You get the picture though. It becomes capricious. I might even feel sorry for a bright mind that sees this and inquires on how to resolve the schizophrenic teachings. I can hear the preacher's response. My child, you must love God and he will give you the answer. But fear him too, for if you sin, he will burn you forever. I can kind of see how it can be used as a grifter's paradise, cut and paste and apply as needed. Interestingly, military training and boot camps use the same kind of brainwashing. A person with authority will tell the recruits to do this or to do the other or whatever. 30 minutes later, more senior authority will give them a contradicting order while berating their efforts on the previous task. This is repeated until the subjects just give up trying to make sense of the authority's intent. All they have to do to get along is just do orders. Just follow them. Don't think. Just carry out the orders. Do as commanded. Any endeavour of trying to make sense of it all just creates confusion. There is no sense to it. It's deliberately made that. Yeah, so I was just thinking, it reminds me of one of the first jobs I had in banking was to write a document management product. So obviously banks have to be careful what they say in letters to their customers. It's legally binding. So the legals approved all these paragraphs that address certain issues. Certain paragraphs could be used in combinations with others to articulate certain things. So we had to ensure that the branch managers or the customer service people could not insert certain combinations. And free typing was not enabled. You created these documents by selecting paragraphs. Often, though, mainly, in most cases, the standard full templates were adequate for the response, so it'd be like a full page text for this incident, a full page text for that incident. It's all worked out. And occasionally, they'd want to insert specific paragraphs to address a specific issue. But after a while, these paragraphs, they are the assembly of texts, and who wrote them years ago was forgotten. The divine source. However, in the bank, of course, we learned about project management and process ownership and implemented life cycles of products and expiration dates. Yeah, so there's that. So recognition that things move on, that in the future things will change and someone needs to look after that change. Assignment of responsibility and change management was the big thing. As a side note, it's a fascinating subject to study in of itself. It's a lot of work. A lot. Probably why ancient texts got neglected. Another story. Story time. Once upon a time, in a convention room, many, many years ago, there was an ethics convention meeting. That's a delicious ambiguity in of itself. Ethics convention. Anyway, this is lifted from a story told by Simon Blackburn, a professional philosopher. So if you're inclined to learn more, definitely check out his work. So this, as the story goes, I'm going to tell it in the first person, of course, because it makes more sense, but it's not my story. It's Simon Blackburn's. So the speakers at this convention went one after another. The Buddhist came up and said, "This is the way to enlightenment," and described what it was all about. Everyone clapped, and they said, "If that works for you." Then a Hindu came up to the podium, talked of cycles of birth and rebirth and the way to release and to live a harmonious life and so on. Everyone clapped, and they said, "If it works for you." And then the Catholic priest had his turn, came up to the podium, talked of Jesus and promises of salvation, and everyone clapped, and they all said, "Terrific, if it works for you." "No, goddammit," he said while banging his hands on the lectern. "It's not a question if it works for me. It's the word of God and the only way to redemption. And if you don't believe it, you're going to hell." And everyone clapped and said, "Terrific, if it works for you." I think that's the way to look at it. It introduces relativism. If it works for you, keep on. We, us, others, we'll keep doing what works for us, thanks. Dear. That there's no divine or singular source of what can be or ought to be applied to all. Extended cultural relativism becomes individually subjective. So we already mentioned constant conjunction in regard to causality. Aristotle put forward the notion of 4 fundamental types of why, what we'd call why today. In this, the answers were more akin to explanations of why things happen or what the causes of things are, rather than what we would today think of as causes in terms of a reduction to a constant conjunction that explains causal events. explained that earlier, so I don't need to repeat it here. So this is more along the lines of, I think the word is called aiton, A-I-T-O-N, Aiton. Who or what is responsible, who or what is to be credited with the change in the state of affairs. It's not quite guilt or blame, but that kind of thing, but more along the lines of responsible. Who's responsible? Who's caused this? Who's made these ripples? Who's brought this into being? So this concerns itself with the recognition of change that we talked about before from one state to another state or configuration. Aristotle put forward 4 explanations. The first being material, or of the matter, the material cause, the substance, the raw material. For a statute, for example, why I keep saying statute? A statue, not statute, statue. This might be the bronze or the marble. Then the second form is formal cause, the arrangement of the substance, its configuration, its assembly, or its deformation, possibly a concept or a pattern. Consider a statue carved from marble. When does it stop being a lump of marble and actually become a statue? Is it at the time of conception in the stonemason's mind, or upon completion? Or is it that an outside observer recognises that something qualitative exists over and above the lump of rock or marble? By way of a tangent, this is known as constitutionalism. I can't quite get my head around. Well, okay, I don't know if it's to be taken seriously. The idea is that the marble existed before the statue, and the marble will exist, say, after the statue is destroyed or crushed. Therefore, the marble and the statue have different properties. Because a thing cannot be different from itself, these must be 2 different things. I say this as a slide in linguistics. It's a difference created by semantics. So I think the discussion of constitutionalism can be viewed through the lens of a Star Trek transporter. Disintegrated and reconstituted, or actually transported via transmutation. Either way, is it really you that emerges from the transport at the other end? Okay, harder question. If the reconstitution is done without the disintegration of the original, if we're assuming it's a deconstruction and a reconstruction rather than a transport, I know it's called transporter, but the idea is it's disassembled and reassembled. What happens if the reassembly takes place without disassembling the original? We now have 2. Which is the real? And the more time we take to decide, the more each individual becomes in the meantime, as each starts to diverge in their own experience from that point of materialization. If it's true to say, as we will later, that one thing cannot be different from itself, these 2 beings do differ, it's presumed, at least in spatial attribute, so they are distinguishable to an external observer. It seems a linguistic slide or a malformed question to ask which is the real one, because there isn't one anymore, there's 2. It seems that the best that the constitutionalist can conclude is that one of them must be real, but cannot say which. Quick, shoot one, and it doesn't matter which. And that done, have you actually killed anyone as the person is still here? Of course you have, of course we have, we'll kill somebody. Problems occur if we don't. Well, those 2 people now go home. Whose home is it? Which gets claim on the assets? Perhaps these things are impossible in practice, but this is casuistry in action. Casuistry can help us reveal some things hidden in plain sight, as it were. Claim on the assets? How were the assets secured in the first place? What does it mean to secure? What is security? That's a euphemism for the legitimised monopoly on violence. Legitimised by what authority? And so on. It gets us asking questions in an abstract context, so we're not prejudiced by that context. It takes the familiar out and puts it in an unfamiliar grounding so that we start to ask questions that our prejudice before would just not have allowed. The third in Aristotle's causes is agent, an external influence, force and energy that's directed at matter to form. In the example we were giving, the statue is the stonemason. And the fourth is why the first 3 arise together at all. It's the purpose, it's the final cause of it all. A bit later we'll touch on this in regard to material participation and formal participation. These ideas alive and well. So here then we have a stack of, let's say, causes or incidental requirements or perhaps coincidental responsibility. And where there's responsibility, there exists morals. So I'll give an example of this kind of stack. Procreation, and apply 4 causal forms. So the first form is material. Man and woman are required. I know modern science, this isn't necessarily true anymore, blah, blah, blah. Scares the crap out of the staunch conservatives and adherents of religiosity. But we shall see why in this framework it's irrelevant. Then man and woman, I assume, have to like each other, get close and agree to coalesce future spawn. This is the formal cause. The design of the circumstance, if you like, the process. In the Disney version, since we mentioned it before, this is falling in love, getting married and all of that. And then man and woman gots to fuck. This is the efficient cause, the doing of the deed, the rumpy-pumpy, the gushing of the seed. You can tell I'm a romantic. And then the final cause, the overarching why, to procreate. And it's this final cause that seems to matter most in a lot of religious moral frameworks. The final cause. It's close to God's purpose. That the idea or notion is to strive for perfection in the image of God. And in the rather simplified and grossly assumptive example, procreation is the creation of a new human being in God's image. Therefore, the sexual position used is of no concern. The way man and woman meet is not so important. And it's not even important that any specific man meets any specific woman, but that a man and a woman do meet, and that it's for God's purpose of more children. Thus, anything that roadblocks this or cockblocks is against God's plan and therefore wrong. And in grotesque interpretations I've come across, there are some that really do believe that womanly autonomy, a woman's choice, and a woman's consent are indeed cockblocks to God's will, that procreation take precedent. So I'll come on to a couple of recent examples of this. Needless to say, if you go into the MGTOW, the incel forums and the manosphere, you'll find these attitudes prevalent. You know, women get back in the kitchen, they're just vessels to create many, many children, to have your children, man, to have the children of the man. And beyond that, they're not really anything to do with meaningful relationships. It's just to have more babies. It's quite repugnant. Anyway, this leads to difficulties, by the way, in regard to free will. Can an all-powerful God be cock-blocked so easily? Well, that's not how it's evaluated. You know, consequences are irrelevant in this analysis. It's that you've defied God with your free will, which again has difficulty insofar as if God did not want this, then why give us free will in the first place? Oh wait, we were given free will? We had no say in that, so we are commanded to have free will? It's just messy. So in this kind of moral framework, this paradigm, contraception is wrong, genetic engineering is wrong, perhaps even medical intervention is wrong. It's all God's will type of thing. It's a moral stack of a particular implementation of one sect of a religion. It's simple, it's easy to follow. It gives a reason that raises questions, for example, about homosexuality. Again, it's seen as a blocker to God's will, you know, of one man, one woman creating more little ones of God's image. And so there is a kind of weird rational thought that for each homosexual male, a woman might be denied coupling possibilities because it's taking men out of the seed pool. However, with roughly 3 billion options still remaining, it's not a significant impairment to finding a progenitive mate. But the doctrine is absolute in nature, not probabilistic. No exceptions. Therefore, I suppose it's rather embarrassing to ask the question, why would God install homosexuality into some people? Of course, the staunch defenders will say he did not, he could not, on the flawed argument just described. Those that don't see the flaw might maintain, therefore, that homosexuality is a perversion, not natural, because it goes against God's intent and image. And if this line of assumption is accepted, one can conclude that homosexuality, I presume, can be potentially cured as any other disease, or that it's a choice or satanic influence. Leads us into trouble, does those kinds of thoughts. Nevertheless, now we understand the framework, we can do better than just yell, "You are a religious extremist bigot," while banging on the lectern. Okay, a recent example then, an atrocious one. It was Brazil this week, at the time of writing, August 2020. It's already September by the time of recording. Probably be October by the time it's uploaded. A young girl, underage, yes, raped, sadly, goes on. And in this case, pregnancy was conceived. And yes, I think she was given counselling and support and worked her way through the system to get an abortion. Fucking rough journey, that one. I suppose we might imagine her delight when arriving at the clinic on the day, only to be physically blocked by 30 or 40 far-right grown adults religious protesters forming a human barricade, chanting. And you know that if that young girl had given birth after that, they would have given no fucks. It's not about the birth, it's not about the welfare of it, it's just, this is cock-blocking God's will. And by the way, this hospital that she turned up at, this clinic, was 900 miles away from her local hospital. Yeah, her local refused to assist. How did protesters 900 miles away know to be ready on the day of the young girl's arrival? Yeah. Some shitbag doxed a 10-year-old girl. A 10-year-old. So, her determination of her own bodily autonomy stripped from her again. Raped twice for good measure. Because, I don't want to say God's will. Let's be accurate and say because some people have claimed to be doing God's will, or at least wish to impose their morals in the name of God as some justification. So, Dennis Prager recently put out a video stating that if there were no moral rules and no police, men would grab women and do what they wanted. That's the way men are made. Does that sound familiar? It's an extreme implementation for the procreation and belief that's all men are. Well, it reveals what Dennis Prager thinks about himself. Without rules and the police, he'd be a rapist. And it's also a bit of stochastic terrorism aimed at the women, the inference being that were it not, I presume, for God's law and the police, you'd be raped every day by every man on the street, tube station, railway, airplane and every place of work because, that's how men are, according to Dennis Prager. What a putrid and horrible place he seems to want to make it. It's the courtroom lizard theory all over again. Here is something to fear. Find this person guilty to ensure it doesn't happen to you or your community, regardless of whether this actual individual did it or not. In the same way, therefore, be grateful that moral laws exists and that the police are there, thus preventing the evil that all men would otherwise do. In other words, your very freedom, woman, is by the grace of God and the police. By the way, Prager, ought we worry about those male, atheist police officers? That's the wretched inference, isn't it? Even here, it's so simple, yet Prager gets it wrong. They're blinkered to assume that there is some supreme authority, therefore, that they must submit to the next genius they meet, and able to even hold the notion of an authoritarian model. Everything then becomes subservient in this kind of chain of authority. And here is the case with Prager. The greater authority, the purpose or the form, is considered before the needs and desires of others. Those are almost inconsequential by comparison to the glorious cause, the final cause. This is the framework Prager's using, and it's pervasive throughout their videos. So I've laboured this one quite a bit, but there are many points to be made in such a moralistic framework and how it's quite deviant from a moral philosophy based on reason and empathy. This is based on authoritarian subservience with emphasis on the virtues, the final cause, the ultimate will of the ultimate authority, often expressed as God's will. And this framework objects to anything and everything that hampers that supposed will. It's barely a moral framework, it's justification and external agency, the authority or the supreme being said so. It's deferment of responsibility to those greater up the chain. We do it because they say so, and those higher up the authoritarian chain are the ones to whom we ought to defer. And on a personal evaluation, I see abdication of responsibility is to dehumanize. Personal responsibility is all we really have. Take that away and we take away choice. And to deny choice, I can't think of a greater torture to a sentient being. But that's from my framework. Others, it seems, actively seek this out. So I've mentioned it on the channel before, Rule 303, I think it's doing the rounds. If you have the means at hand, you have the responsibility to act. Now, whether one actually does act is another question. If you have the means to help, then you have the ability to do so. What compelling reasons would prevent such an action? If we stop for just 1 second and ask, would we like to be treated like that? And if the answer is no, then that's all we need to know. No appeal to a moral authority. And it frightens me that Dennis Prager seems incapable of this basic lack of empathy. It's sociopathic. And the assumption that other men behave themselves is only because they've been given a set of rules and threatened with punishment. It's such a desperate and impoverished view of fellow humans. Worse, because Prager then goes on to make the case that men, from an early age, have been taught or learned that they cannot act out their sexual nature. He's making a horrible inference that all men are a bit rapey, and that that's natural, but have learned to suppress their rapiness. Jesus Christ, Dennis. What is it that Dennis Prager is assuming? All men express their sexuality in the same way he does? impositions of violence, rape, and impositions of power, to deny others choice and say so over what happens to them. Nice one, Dennis, you've revealed yourself. And this dickhead gets on the YouTubes, and he even has the temerity to talk about ethics. I mean, I don't know much about ethics, and I fully admit to that. And for this long audio, there seemed to be a need, at least, to introduce the topic to couch what follows. So, all that said, where do morals come from then? Simple answer, I'm sure you know, it's mum and dad, parent, guardian. Naturally, in some instances, that lays down a solid foundation. In others, it's like Dennis Prager, it's very sketchy, and we can do better. Turns out, Dr. Seuss wasn't bad, Disney not so good, and I've discovered that even our native language has influence on the ways we can linguistically represent and process information. English, it seems, is a language of commerce, and I was astonished to find out 25% of the world's population speaks it. It allows us to slice and dice things more readily, to separate things, to lose, again, lamented on this endless ability to slice and dice and package into infinite forms for the purpose of commercial enterprise. I wonder now if commerce itself is the monetization of virtue. It's the slicing of things into assets and liabilities. So how do moral judgments differ from other practical judgments? One thing we have to keep in mind is that even those who hold unconventional ethical beliefs are still living according to unethical standards if they believe for some reason that it's right to do so in what they're doing. So this hints at the answer, that people are at least prepared to put forward a justification, whether successful or not, is a minimal requirement. Though I referenced mum and dad, it would not be an ethical decision to do a particular thing simply because mum or dad would approve or disapprove. It might be right and it might be good, but because the analysis is not self-referenced, or that it's justified outside of oneself, effectively someone else said to do this, or someone else said not to do this, it falls short of the qualification for ethical. It seems we have to think of this in terms of ethical standards rather than thinking about it in terms of the decision itself. So the former is where a decision is made based on a framework. The latter seems more concerned with a single isolated incident that requires a decision that is made by use of an isolated method, i.e. an external agent told them the answer, they flipped a coin, the holy book said so. So here, for example, I've got to conclude that Prager is not being ethical. He offers no reason. He simply states it as fact that men are this way. And it seems that he doesn't know many men at all, not to even have had a conversation about what a healthy sex life even is. Anyway, hopefully I won't have to mention this doofus again. Suffice to say, it's a tragedy. He's got a platform and a lot of money from elsewhere to spout his rhetoric, which makes him someone else's useful idiot. I think about that, it actually makes a bit more sense. The Wilkes brothers, fracking billionaires, think they were early funders of PragerU. I wonder here again if commerce is exploiting virtue ethics of PragerU to bring about an outcome, the implementation of the so-called useful idiot. It seems that when people take an action with no justification whatsoever, it's outside the domain of ethical. So I'll reveal myself when I make mention that I've seen too many internet comments about how we should just do what the police say, for example. You know, I've watched those videos of police public confrontations. Obviously, we need to keep in mind that only the bad ones end up on the YouTube, so I try to keep in mind most interactions, I hope, don't go like those, and that they don't end up on YouTube, so it's a selection bias. I read the comments. At first impression, they belie a kind of submission. It's perfectly reasonable to hold court with the police or any other agent. You can talk to them, you can negotiate, you can argue with them. Commentators say otherwise. We ought to just do what the police say. Ought to? I can hear the voice of my mother every time. If they told you to jump under a bus, would you do it? And that's another thing. Just so isn't an argument. So, for example, there are some things for complicated reasons I believe we ought not do. While it's tempting to say just don't do it, or in fact just do it. And now that I think about that too in the lens of ethics, I realise the brand behind that isn't advocating for careful consideration, planned effort and strategic goal accomplishment for actualisation, say, but just do it, for fuck's sake. Yeah, so just so are not arguments, though it might be appropriate injunctions for small children, and that's the thing, small children. And just follow orders, just do what you're told. Yeah, I mentioned in the previous audio about devout religious followers and the notion again of what seems to be a devotion to submittance or subservience to the Lord. This feels like the same kind of thing, deferring to the next up the chain of a virtue hierarchy or an authoritarian hierarchy. In the case of police, it's perceived power. Yeah, but again, watching some recent videos coming out from our cousins across the pond, it seems you can get shot and killed for not doing what you're told. And you get shot and killed for doing a lot less, and read into that what you like. The connection I made was that for some, they can't decide. It seems like they have no moral framework to establish what the right thing to do is. So they, in some respects, sensibly seek an appeal to an agent they believe is moralistic, a local priest, an imam, the good book, the police, Jesus, God, and then they do what these figures prescribe. It's a proxy, but it doesn't let them off the hook, because he told me it was the right thing to do. It's not a justification, nor does it qualify as an ethical decision. It's an excuse. Holy shit. Literally millions of people, especially in the US it seems, and the televangelists decreeing piety and positioning themselves as the paragon of virtues. While I think it is a noble and fair assumption to make that the vast majority of people want to live good lives, I've realised morals and ethics and constructing arguments is hard work. Hence I can see the temptation to defer the decisions to those people who we believe have worked out our moral quandaries ahead of time for us. Saves us a lot of time. And previously I had balked at the idea of elites and a political class. I just don't like how it's phrased, elites. Everyone's got a job to do. Now, the idea that one's more important than the other seems ridiculous to me, but anyway. Statecraft, governance, resolving impossible dilemmas, not so easy. It does require a particular skill set and support network contextually appropriate. Any bloody fool can pull the trigger or order a nuke strike. It's also problematic for an outsider to walk into this line of work without generational context. Yeah, the old boy network. Pros and cons. Yes, it results in exclusionary access. Yes, it also creates elites that prop up the current system. Is this good, bad, or necessary? Well, I would say that it would be ideal for every child to have a realistic option of an Eton education followed up by the pathways that leads to. Perhaps we ought to encourage the most capable rather than, those who can leverage those very institutional networks. But those in those very institutional networks are the very ones that can lever those sorts of things to get things done. It seems an intractable problem. I read the public admissions policy of the London School of Economics, for example, and I suppose it's an ethical stance to state that the part of the selection criteria is not only just excellent grades, but also gives weighting to those who will use the education to the greatest effects. In other words, people who are just turning up for a theoretical interest or as an academic exercise to get tickets, they're not really interested in those kind of people. They'll be given less priority. They're actually interested in teaching people who have gusto, who've put in the effort, who are poised to do great things in the world, to use the education to actually make great changes. Perhaps this is code word for only apply if you have connections that will enable you to put this to appropriate use. Many people do spend a lot of time studying this stuff and practicing it and get into politics, and they're in a class of people who practice politics. However, the old switcheroo seems to have happened somewhere along the line where gangsters and grifters have stolen the title of statesman or politician and ascribed it to themselves to crowbar themselves into politics and power. The fact that they are in the political machinery alone does not make them a prudent member of a professional politic or good governor or person with excellent statecraft. Similarly, wearing a white lab coat and protective eyewear does not make you a scientist. Talking in word salad using scientific and technical terms does not turn a woo-woo peddler into the next Einstein either. This is delusional thinking. I'm laughing because I'm reminded of a guy on YouTube. Hi, I'm John Pendleton, chemist, and he was all about young earth creationist, and he was trying to say because he was a chemist he had the inside track, but it turned out I think he was a dentist that could use some chemicals, to numb the gum. Yeah. It's delusional thinking, as I say. It's limited in awareness only to the level of the aesthetics, the surface level stuff. It's like Trump's remarks, it's going to get colder, the weather, in terms of global warming. No, it's going to get colder. Trust me, science doesn't know. But he doesn't understand the difference between climate change and weather. Again, he's only paying attention to surface level aesthetics. Yes, some days are hotter than others. It's irrelevant to climate change. So in the cases where one's following orders, there's been no decision. It's merely an imitation or substitute for one. An action was taken devoid of any personal inquiry into why that decision ought to have been made in this way or that. the focus is on the why that decision, rather than a resultant set or of possible other actions. It's one thing to say, because the Holy Book said so. It's another to say, well, I read these passages in the Holy Book and it got me to thinking, and I realised that this action seems appropriate based on the underlying circumstances and a desire for a particular outcome based on the circumstances with intention or other. In the latter, the agent is thinking for themselves, albeit inspired by the good book, whether that be the Bible, the Lorax, Dr. Seuss, Star Trek, or even a book on ethics. And it has to be said that history is littered with the blood and carnage of people who misinterpreted texts or simply followed orders. I haven't spilt blood, but, I've been there, I've done it. I knew the directive was idiotic and that it would result in a mini disaster, but you can't tell them. So I did exactly as specified, followed orders, the calamity occurred, and here's the takeaway lesson. My superior at the time didn't get into trouble. Turns out he was just following orders too, and his boss didn't get in trouble either. He was just following orders, and his boss didn't get in trouble either. He owned the company, had lots of money. The diffusion of responsibility, there's no one left to blame, no one left to hold to account. It's finger pointing all the way up, and the buck, as it were, never stops. Responsibility is just diffused out. I'd say things like Star Trek, modern day equivalents of casuistry. It's almost teaching ethics and morals by stealth. We have enjoyment from the programme. Yeah, fan. The original series, The Next Generation, Voyager. I missed Enterprise and Deep Space Nine. I hear DS9 was quite good. Anyway, the original series and TNG. I've mentioned TNG before on the channel, the Inner Light episode, in regard to life and the meaning of it and how it goes so fast and it's too quickly forgotten. That was in the Francis Bacon episodes. Coincidentally, Red Letter Media, if you follow them on YouTube, they just did their top 5 Trekkie episodes, and they did mention the moral and ethical dilemmas presented in the episodes. The episode called Measure of a Man being pertinent. So reading Peter Singer's book on practical ethics, it's not just the measure of a man, but he asks the question that what is it that distinguishes the rights and privileges of humans over other conscious beings, for example. In this particular episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, it's argued that Data, the android, sentient, self-aware as far as we know, and with free will, is still property. The people in the lab want to take him apart to find out how he was built so that they can build more of him, or it. However, this would mean the destruction of the android, Data. Picard, the captain of the ship, will not allow Data to voluntarily submit to this procedure, which is actually just as bad a basis for making that determination, again treating him like property. He won't allow him to voluntarily do it. Further conflict is set up by Picard's command superiors ordering Data to submit to the procedure. Data, then not quite being of free will, can't seem to override his command imperative to fulfill the order. So I wonder if Data actually had free will at all. Riker, the second in command and friend to Data by a twist of fate and circumstance as contrived, is ordered to defend the case of the lab people and to make the case that Data does not classify as human, a person, or an entity of free will. Yes, Riker is ordered to do that against his own free will. Makes me think that there's a little bit of hierarchical command structure subversion there by the script writers, and a poke at the arbitrary nature of command structures. It occurred to me that while the show highlights these moral dilemmas, the impossible choices, the Kobayashi Maru, the no-win scenario for which Kirk and Star Trek are famous, that fans of the show will internalise these moral teachings. It occurred to me that others might watch the show and come to conclude that it's the top echelons of management and command structures who always make the right choice, and therefore decisions ought to be deferred up the ladder, up to the geniuses or up to the top levels of power. Yet that pays, again, only attention to the aesthetic. Picard, commander of the ship, more often than not asks his senior bridge crew for recommendations, and they talk it through, offering different contextualised suggestions with implications for the consequence. It also occurred to me that there might be another group of people who can't tolerate the ambivalence and just can't make the decision or don't want the responsibility, and so will always defer. I can imagine making life and death decisions. It destroys the soul, and I don't believe in souls, but I hold the previous statement to be true. It's why I think we ought not needlessly torture and kill animals just for fun or personal gratifications, or matters of convenience. And I also suspect there exists a very frustrated subgroup in this latter group, those who want the power of command, but without the commensurate liability. nor are they prepared to put in the endless hours of study, matched only by an equal number of hours gaining experience in the context to understand what being in command actually entails, discharging liabilities. Again, on the channel we mentioned before, it's why the captain of a ship gets to tell everyone else what to do. She is liable for the thing and the staff. Something, by the way, I think that sections of the police force need to hold in their minds. They're not judge, jury and executioner, but trustees, public servants. They're there to serve the public, and that includes people in their custody. They are custodians of those they arrest. They are charged with looking after them, and it seems forgotten that if there is a person in public doing damage, locking them up for a short time is for their own protection, as well as the protection to the general public. It immediately stops them doing more damage and incurring more liabilities. It's for their own good, in a way, that the police come and arrest people who are doing public harm or self-harm or have immediate potential for doing harm. So perhaps the way to look at it is an arrest is what it sounds like. It's a slowing down, it's a restraining, it's an attenuation. Much in the same way as, when those airplanes, those jets land on aircraft carriers, they have an arrestor cable to slow it down, to restrain it, to stop it falling off the edge and doing a lot of damage. So I think the way to look at arrest is to always view it as a protective custody for all. It's not to put the boot in because we think they've done wrong and they deserve a good kicking from power to teach them a lesson, albeit that served under the term, qualified indemnity as such, so they can do it and get away with it, and then just say, oh, it was a resisting arrest charge. I presume this is the way it's supposed to work, that the police have a duty of care to look after the arrested corpus. It doesn't mean that they get to do with it as they please, but I think it's a point of contention that it's written or interpreted in the Bible that God gave man dominion over the animals. It's ambiguous. Dominion to look after, nurture and cherish, or dominion to do any filthy and depraved act it could imagine. As Madonna eloquently put it, poor is the man whose pleasures depend upon the permission of another. It's a nice double, triple meaning in that one, and you're free to take whichever interpretation you like. So I reckon thinking of arrests as protective custody is the way to think about it. Okay, yeah, might need to use appropriate force to get them into the back of the van and into the holding cell and so on. That's another thing I've seen on the YouTube videos where the cops yell, stop resisting arrest. Right there, that's a legal determination they made. Usually, and normally and properly, that's for a court or a judge to decide, not a police officer. See, judge, jury, and therefore executioner thinking. So I would suppose that when we are young, we defer to our parents or guardians to make the ethical decisions. It may also be the case that many people have been instructed to look at the Bible or other texts for moral guidance. And after 20 years, some adults have not re-evaluated this process of deciding. How do you weigh moral dilemmas? What frameworks are available? As I say, it seems out of habit. Many defer to authority, be that the next genius that they perceive, or the next up their own particular value hierarchy or virtue hierarchy. Are they smarter than I am, or they're more experienced than I am, or they're a better believer than I am, or they've been doing it for longer than I am, whatever that proxy is. Or they do what their friends do, and it's a habit rather than any internal agency. And I have to wonder if one day, quite soon, AI will be making ethical judgments. Habitual behaviour then. Weak as that is, it's an attempt at a justification that may or may not be satisfactory. We state, we've always done it like that, and so then nothing changes. It doesn't, the decision hierarchy, the moral framework doesn't adapt to new conditions. Like I said before, people can get to the right conclusion for the wrong reason, on flawed logic and flawed premises. It doesn't make their argument sound, it's a lucky guess, and the world moves on. So those traditions of bygone eras no longer may be suitable. Tension between regressives and progressives increases, especially where excessive exuberance is directed, the polarization. Likewise with behaviours, it might be considered right and moralistic by other observers who can and would defend and justify it. But for those doing the action that cannot, it is outside of ethical. It's something else, habit, because they're told to, orders, duty. No choice, had to. Fear, shame, guilt, money, ideology, ego. So we'll bring this one to a close. That's about an hour. So just close with the question, what kind of justifications then? What qualifies ethical consideration? So we'll answer that question in the next one.